Hello. How's the how's the audio? Okay. Welcome. It's been a little while since I've done a live video. Let's see how you guys are doing in the chat. How many people we have in the chat? Only 13. Go tell your friends, your mom, your pops. Let me know how I'm sounding. Let's do a sound check. Anybody? Anybody in the chat? Can you hear me? Okay, perfect. Well, we have a treat for you. So this came about because I've got one last lecture for my ethics class, and I have to be away Tuesday, so I promised them, what if I just pre-record the lecture or live stream it, and we could finish that up, and then I can do my church duties and go to liturgy on Tuesday for the feast day of St. Herman's. So what we've been doing is we've been covering Russ Shafer-Landau's The Fundamentals of Ethics. The previous week, we did what's called ethical pluralism. Ethical pluralism, that's not relativism. I'll explain to you what ethical pluralism is. Most of the moral theories that we covered in this course, it's a university course on ethics, they've been absolutist, meaning there's some sort of moral rule that can never ever be broken. Can you ever lie? An absolutist would say, no, you can never ever lie. And most of those theories, whether they be consequentialism, Kant's deontological ethics, I'm trying to think of hedonism, desire satisfaction theory, ethical egoism. All of these are what we call monistic theories. And last week we had covered in his book chapter 15, which was ethical pluralism. And again, most of the theories that we've gone over are what we call ethical monism. Ethical monist theories all assume and argue there's one supreme rule that serves as a basis for all morality. And that supreme rule is absolute, means that it can never be permitted to be broken. And that this moral rule, if you're ethical monist, is fundamental. That means you might have rules in your ethics in your daily lives, but ultimately it's going to boil down to one fundamental rule. There will be no more basic rules that would justify that supreme rule. It's kind of foundational and fundamental. So again, whatever rules that you have, if you're an ethical monist, those justifications, the justification for those rules link to more general and more basic rules that ultimately is going to boil down to a fundamental one supreme rule. So let me just go over real quick. I've got some, and this will be beneficial for my students in the class who are watching. Just to recap, I'll just power through the PowerPoint slides from chapter 15. If you guys have any questions, feel free. You can also make tips or super chat, and I'll answer your questions here in the link. Don't forget to sign up for Patristic Faith. I put in the links there, we can get you on the mailing list, and then you see all the other social media for Patristic Faith. You can follow us there and our content providers. And each week, yes, we're going to be announcing more surprise team members joining our team, people that you really like. I don't want to announce who it's going to be just yet. Let's get the suspense up. So anyways, let's return back to ethics. And I'll just go through, excuse me, real fast what we covered last week, if you're my students in my class. And then that'll just segue really nice into chapter 16. And that's it. That's the end of the world. No, the end of our class. Maybe it's the end of the world, but at least you have completed your ethics course if it is the end of the world, and that'll be nice. Okay. Chapter 15. Ethnic pluralism. It's not ethnic pluralism. That was a typo on that's hilarious. Ethical pluralism. Come on, PowerPoint. You know these autocorrects, right? But I made for good laughs. Not ethnic pluralism. Ethical pluralism and absolute moral rules. So we saw in chapter 15, as I just discussed, ethical monism is the family of views according to which there is one supreme rule that serves as the basis of all morality. An ethical rule is supreme if it is both, here we go, absolute. What does that mean? It's never permissibly broken. Think about lying or torture or something like that. It's always wrong to torture the innocent. Maybe that is an absolute ethical rule that you have. But then again, maybe you're like, well, the only way to prevent this terrorist act is to get the waterboard torture out and gotta save lives. Then you're not an absolutist when it comes to, it's like, well, sometimes it can be broken. Or you're hiding, I don't know, let's say, I'm thinking, you should always deliver on your promises. And then you're homicidal. You promised your neighbor you'd give back his gun, but now you found out he's a homicidal maniac. Do you break your rule? That's what this is supposed to illustrate. An absolutist would say, oh, never break the rule. You might be inclined to say, yeah, I will. Well, again, here's another one. It's not just for a ethical monist that the rules are absolute, but they're fundamental. That means not justified by some more basic fundamental rule. Okay, got that. Here's some examples of ethical monism: utilitarianism, ethical egoism, I already said that, divine command theory, Kantianism, that was the deontological ethics that I was talking about, and maybe you could think of some others. Ethical pluralism, though, in contrast, we learned, is the family of views according to which there is more than one fundamental moral rule. Some pluralists believe that moral rules are absolute. So keep that in mind. Just because you think that moral rules are absolute doesn't immediately throw you into the category of ethical monism. Because some actually believe, some ethical pluralists believe that they're absolute. Well, going back, why would ethical monism be appealing? Well, for one, it provides a unified theory, and we all would like our stuff unified, right? That's appealing. I'd like to imposes order, organizational morality. I don't want to have a kind of violation of Occam's razor in my ethics. But as I discussed in chapter 15, there were problems with all monist theories. And there's three ways you could go about dealing with that. Well, I'll just find a new monism to subscribe to, a new ethical monism. Well, yeah, you can do that. Option 2 is just fix it. Whatever the problem is with your theory, ethical theory, just fix it. And, of course, the last we discussed is, well, just abandon monism. What am I going to abandon it to? Ethical pluralism. Okay. We talked about the argument from disaster prevention. So this is supposed to be a critique of ethical monism. For example, I think we talked about torture might actually prevent a catastrophe. Now, this is a more kind of general argument, but premise 1, if there are any absolute moral rules, then we're never permitted to break them. Okay, that's just true by definition. Premise 2, every moral rule may be permissibly broken if, in doing so, is necessary to prevent a catastrophe. Therefore, there are no absolute moral rules. So, this is again an argument against absolutism. And maybe you agree with that. We talked about the challenge for absolutism. We talked about the doctrine of double effect. And that basically stated that, with respect to the argument from disaster prevention, provided that your goal is worthwhile, you are sometimes permitted to act in ways that foreseeably cause certain harms, though you must never intend to cause those harms. And we talked about what that was doing was separating what you intend from what you foresee. And this was supposed to get you out of certain ethical problems. That, look, I'm not aiming for this, but it's most likely going to happen. And as long as I'm not aiming for something immoral, then I'll be cool. Why? Because I never intended for that harm, because it's not my aim, even though I probably foresee that it would happen. Yes, that would justify a non-consequentialist approach to ethics, but the worry, as we saw, it can be difficult to distinguish between foreseen effects from the intended effects. And going back, the doctrine of double effect assumes that premise 2 is actually false. Okay, then we talked about another challenge for absolutism, and again, these are arguments from ethical pluralism. The argument from contradiction. If there is, premise 1, if there's more than one absolute moral rule, then rules are bound to conflict at some point. If absolute rules ever conflict, then this generates contradiction. And 3, if a theory generates contradiction, then it's false. Therefore, any theory that endorses the existence of more than one absolute moral rule is false. And that's a powerful argument that we saw. Bound to happen, you're going to get certain absolute moral rules that are going to conflict. Perhaps never cause harm, and always deliver on your promises, and then think about your homicidal neighbor that you promised to give the gun back to. That is going to be a problem for absolutism, as we saw. Another challenge for absolutism, in that theme, they could respond, whether moral rules will contradict each other depends on their content, and moral rules forbidding certain actions such as torture, rape, or terrorism are unlikely to conflict. Does that satisfy you? Maybe not. Maybe that's not enough. The response, that is, to make you feel at ease with the objections that were just raised. Another challenge for absolutism we saw was the argument from irrationality. Premise 1, if perfect obedience to a rule can frustrate the underlying purpose for the rule, then the rule is irrational. 2, perfect obedience to an absolute moral rule can sometimes frustrate its underlying purpose. Therefore, absolute moral rules are irrational. And we talked about the reply to the argument from irrationality insists that premise 2 is false. Well, of course, that's where they would have to go, right? Where else are you going to go? Premise 1 or premise 2? Premise 2, if you're going to attack. Well, the fundamental purpose of a moral rule is to forbid people from acting in certain ways. The doctrine we talked about of doing and allowing, it's always morally worse. What does that mean? The doctrine of doing and allowing states that it's always morally worse to do harm than to allow that same harm to occur. And so we talked about, if you remember, the trolley problem. I mean, there was a lot of different ethical conundrums and issues that we went over. But if anybody's not familiar, the trolley problem, the trolley's racing down the track, and there's 5 people tied up, and then you can pull the lever, and it'll divert that. So you're going to save 5 people, but the problem is it's going to run the one person over. And what do? Now, if you're a utilitarian, obviously you're going to try to get the best results, right? So maximize the benefit will overall maximizing the benefit while reducing the harm. So yes, one person's going to die, but certainly 5 people are saved. Now, that's very utilitarian. Maybe you're not actually convinced of that. And so we brought up an example of, well, what if the only way was to push a really large man onto the tracks to save? So the weight of this man's going to actually stop the train. And he'll certainly die. But hey, you've saved 5 people at the cost of 1. But doesn't that just morally leave a bad taste in your mouth? Now, some people, I always found that was an interesting example, because so many people will be like, well, I'd pull the lever, right, to save the 5 people, even if it killed 1 person. But they wouldn't be so confident in actually pushing the heavy person onto the tracks. Why? Isn't that kind of interesting? For some reason in their mind, they think they're not as involved with the lever as they are pushing. But all of this brings back to the point that, well, perhaps you might actually say, let me just rewind. Pulling the lever is actually doing something. You're now involved in the game. Pushing and to illustrate that it's the same principle, you would say, of course you're in the game, and now you're ethically involved when you push the heavy person on to the tracks. And maybe you'd say, I'm not willing to do that. Why? Well, you might actually appeal to something like the doctrine of doing and allowing. Because it's always morally worse to do harm than to allow that same harm to occur. So let's go back to, and we went over objections of this too, the counterexamples. If you remember, sorry, I forgot to put the PowerPoint back up. Oh, an easy rescue case was a counterexample. Let's see. The other one that I thought was really interesting too was the nurse charged with giving a bedridden patient a life-saving pill every 4 hours, but she's an evil nurse. And when the appointed time comes, she stands by, pill in hand, and does nothing. So do you see this doctrine of doing and allowing? She's allowing the patient to die, but suppose she instead had obtained a poison pill and given the patient, rather than the real medication. He dies as a result. Well, what's the problem here? Well, if the doctrine of doing and allowing is true, then giving the person the poison pill is morally worse than deliberately withholding the medicine? Is it? So I thought that was an excellent objection. And that basically calls into question the doctrine of doing and allowing. Any questions so far? So that wraps up just kind of a summary of what we did in chapter 15. And now we can move into chapter 16. Prima facie, duties in ethical particularism. Doesn't that sound super interesting? So remember, none of this is relativism. We had covered relativism in, I think, early on in the semester. All that ethical pluralism is saying is they're, instead of reducing down to one fundamental moral rule that's absolute, meaning never can be broken, you perhaps might have several moral rules that you, and we'll talk about this because there's, in this chapter, an Oxford professor, W.D. Ross, who actually has a list of that. And as we mentioned in chapter 15, you may actually be an ethical pluralist, meaning I have a list of kind of rules that I apply. Doesn't Jordan Peterson have 12 rules in my ethical pluralism? Well, it depends what you really mean by ethical pluralism, then. Maybe he is an ethical pluralist, but doesn't mean he's a relativist. In fact, you could, as what did we say in chapter 15, you could be an ethical pluralist and hold that those moral rules are absolute. Somebody had asked a great question. Somebody asked this in last class. Could we say that withholding an action is being done? So somebody last class had a great point. You're still choosing, but notice the way that was framed in the doctrine of doing and allowing is it wasn't framed in terms of choice. You're always making a choice to either do or allow. That's not what makes something, the choice is not what, in this context, what makes something morally relevant or not. It's whether you actively do something. Let's put it this way. Whether you choose to actively do something versus whether you choose to withhold. I'm not going to be an actor in the game. That's what seems to be morally relevant. So on prima facie, on the face of it, it would seem that, yes, it seems, in many cases, a lot worse to actually do a harm rather than let it happen. And it was just, it wasn't in terms of like, oh, you're still choosing. Of course you're still choosing, but that's not the relevant. It's whether it actually is true, whether it makes a difference, whether you enter into the circumstances of the game and you actually do an action in the event of all those things happening, or if you say, I'm not involved. I was actually thinking about, you have some, I don't know, let's say it's an SS officer and he's saying, shoot this person, and he's got a gun to your head. In fact, isn't that the beginning of the movie Ostrov, the island? Would it be, in your mind, obviously he's under duress, but would it be better in your mind to allow something bad to happen or to actually do the action. And maybe he'll kill you both. Maybe that's the thing. It's like, you're going to die. We might be convinced that, you know what, that's on the SS officer. I'm not actually doing that. And I'm not going to be involved in the sick game of having to shoot my captain on the tugboat. So you're both going to die. Well, you might be like, well, I'm not a utilitarian consequentialist, so sorry, SS officer, you didn't get me. God, now I'm dead. I died. But maybe you're morally correct to do so. That's kind of what we're talking about. Okay, let's just jump right into it, shall we? Switch to chapter 16. Ethical pluralism. Yeah, it's a continuation of 15. But this time, prima facie duties and ethical particularism. So, what did we learn? Yeah. Ethical pluralism, they believe there are a number of moral rules. Not one rule, but a plurality of them. If you're an absolutist, you believe they can never be broken. But let's look at another alternative within ethical pluralism to the absolutists. Okay, these theories are pluralistic, like I said. What does that mean? They endorse the existence of at least two fundamental rules. And each of these rules is non-absolute, meaning there's obviously times and circumstances they probably could be broken. It would be morally acceptable to. And as I mentioned, somebody who was famous for first developing this was the Oxford professor W.D. Ross. And he had a special term for non-absolute rules. He called them principles of prima facie duty. And let's just stick with that. Let's stick with that term. A prima facie duty, well, what is it? It's an excellent, permanent, non-absolute reason to do or refrain from something. And none of these duties can be derived from another one, or from more basic principles. That means, and crucially so, each prima facie duty may sometimes be overridden by other such duties. So you have a list of them. So sometimes they can be overridden by others. So each one of them is fundamental. And like I said, each one of those fundamental duties can be outweighed by competing reasons on any particular occasion. So though there's always a good reason, say, to keep a promise or prevent harm, remember the psychopath, homicidal neighbor, morality sometimes requires that we break a promise. Or sometimes it requires we do harm, is the view. Okay, and we're going to talk about that's, you might think that just pushes you straight into utilitarianism, consequentialism, but it doesn't. And we'll talk about that in a little bit. Okay, any questions so far? So, this guy Ross, let me just see in the chat in case you guys have any questions. You guys enjoying this? Don't forget, you can put tips and donations to me there in the Streamlabs chat right there. Okay. So, this old guy, Ross, he was convinced that absolutism in all its forms was implausible. Those theories that endorse more than one absolute rule, he thought, look, like we discussed in the previous chapter, they're bound to, at some point, contradict each other. So, Ross instead endorsed, he believed that those who endorse a single absolute rule, they're just too narrow. This is what the problem is. So, they fail to see that there actually are a number of independent and important moral considerations. He accepted, in some sense, the utilitarian emphasis on doing good and preventing harms to others. But he also agreed with Kant that justice was morally important in its own right. Utilitarians don't actually think that. So notice he doesn't have to go into either one of those camps of kind of consequentialism or deontological Kantian ethics. And so he said, look, again, I'm a pluralist. There's several kind of fundamental rules that I apply in my life. And prima facie duties. So let's look at Ross's list of prima facie duties. There's 7 of them. He has reparations, repairing harm that we have done, gratitude, well, appropriately acknowledging benefits that others have given to us. Pretty straightforward, right? Well, he also thinks an important duty is justice, ensuring that virtue is rewarded and vice is punished. Beneficence, enhancing the intelligence, virtue, or pleasure of others. Self-improvement is also an important rule, isn't it? And duty. Making oneself more intelligent or virtuous. Sure, I think we agree with that. Fidelity, keeping our promises and being faithful to our word. Non-malfeasance, which means preventing harm to others. Now, Ross did say that's not a complete list. He's just giving you some examples, right? He allowed that there might be other prima facie duties. But let's just talk about prima facie, which just literally means like at first glance or first sight, on the face of things or something like that. First face, literally translated. And but what does it mean here? Well, it could be misleading because first, these things really aren't duties, but rather permanent moral reasons. So you can't get rid of them. They're moral reasons. But they partially determine whether an action truly is, in the end, morally required. So they're not going to do it all by their own. They partially will. For example, there is a prima facie duty, beneficence, is to say the following. There's always a strong reason to benefit others. This reason may sometimes be outweighed by competing reasons. And 3, this is what prima facie duty means, beneficence. 3, if this reason is the only moral reason that applies in a given situation, then benefiting others becomes our all things considered duty. In other words, what we are really finally morally required to do in the situation. So, if we focus for a moment on the first part, there's always a strong reason to benefit others. It provides us with a way to test good old Ross's specific roster of prima facie duties. And for example, suppose that there are situations in which we have no reason at all to benefit others. If that were so, there would be no prima facie duty of beneficence. Now, even if Ross his 7 prima facie duties here includes too much or too little, it's not going to be a problem for him. It's not going to undermine the ethic of prima facie duties. What it would show, and certainly this would obviously be relevant and important, is that Ross's own list was off base. And then again, so what? You get a better list that might make the cut. It doesn't throw out the theory. Okay, so what that means is we can kind of consider the big picture. What's attractive about this theory as a general model of morality? Okay, advantages. Let's consider what's attractive. It accommodates the sense there is more than a single fundamental ethical consideration. I got a frog in my throat. I'm sorry about that. So, the ability to accommodate that we do have a sense then there's more than one single moral consideration. It might seem to you, obviously it did to Ross, that the very fact that we're having promised to do something generates some reason to follow through, even if keeping our promises fails to bring happiness, reward, virtue, prevent misery, or do anything else. That we have given our word is reason enough to do what we have promised. But look, no one's going to believe that promising is the only thing that's like this. There does something, I guess, appears to be immoral to all of us. For instance, when someone repays a kindness with ingratitude. Even if in unusual circumstances being ungrateful is the right way to go. So maybe you don't agree with Ross's list, but you can obviously see or agree, hey, look, fidelity and gratitude, they have some moral importance in their own right. And if you believe that, that's enough to push you away from ethical monism. Okay, next. Another advantage of Ross's view of pluralism is that we're sometimes permitted to break the moral rules. And Ross's view of pluralism would explain that. Why? Because they're non-absolute. The example here, there's always something to be said. Why? Because of the prima facie, yeah, you should keep your promises. That's one of the rules that you use, but it's not absolute. Should I break my promise to meet my student for coffee if my wife has a medical emergency? See what I'm saying? So, pluralism is going to give you a way to out of that. I'd be like, no, it's not an absolutist, but I have some fundamental. Maybe there's 7, maybe you're Jordan Peterson, you have 12. I don't know. Let's see what you guys are doing in the chat. Yeah, I bet you didn't know this is actually what ethical pluralism. When you hear it, you think of relativism or something like that, but it's not as bad as it sounds. Let's see if anybody's made any Stream Labs donations. And I'll take this time to read them out or answer any questions in there. Nope, sorry. I guess being charitable isn't one of your 7, just joking, 7 Rossian rules of pluralistic rules. It's a joke, hey, take it easy. Okay, let's go back. Well, here's another advantage. It explains moral conflict. the ethic of prima facie duties can make good sense of our experience of moral conflicts. What does that mean, moral conflicts? When duties conflict when they can't all be fulfilled. So, you might ask, well, what the heck does that mean? Well, first of all, rewind back to chapter 15. On absolutist views, such conflicts yield contradictions. They can never be broken. And contradictions is a good reason, and maybe not just a good reason, it is a sufficient reason to reject a theory. But what would that look like? What would moral conflict when you can't fulfill multiple duties? Well, consider this case. A poor mom whose child's so sick, too sick to go to school. Obviously, the mom has a duty to report to work. Why? Because she took the job and she promised to reliably show up as scheduled. But imagine some circumstances. Look, she just moved to town. She has no friends, no family. She can't find somebody to look after her child. And she can't bring her child to work. But look, she also has a duty to care for her child, especially if no one else is around to do so. What should she do? Well, if you're an absolutist and you've got what? You've got a conflict that yields a contradiction. And so that might be a reason for you to say, well, I'm not going with the absolutist. But a Rossian can say of this example that there is a conflict of prima facie duties. There is a strong case for showing up to work. Why? Because they're all important, they're just not absolute. But there's also a strong reason to care for one's child. And sometimes, yes, you can't do both. Ross's theory can account for that. And it can account for it without any contradiction occurring. Why? Because you can distinguish between a standing reason, a prima facie duty to do something, and then all things considered final duty to do it. And when those final duties conflict, when we say in the end that you are absolutely required to show up to work, so there's like a conflict when you say you're absolutely required to show up to work, and you're also absolutely required to care for your child. And when you say that conflict leads to a contradiction. Ross's view avoids that problem entirely. And if Ross's view is correct, what's important about this? Context. Context is kind of what determines. The consideration at the heart of such a duty, whether it's promise keeping, preventing harm, righting one's wrongs, it's always morally important. There's something intrinsic about it, but it's not always morally decisive. And that's exactly what distinguishes prima facie duty from an absolute one. What do you guys think? Any questions so far? And I think we're going to go into discussions about 24. We can get the numbers up. Can I get those numbers up? 23. I said it and it goes down. Thank you for leaving. Let's see if anybody made a Streamlabs chat. Tip. Thank you, Gen Z Philosophy. Donate $5. Thank you so much. You have been beneficent. Unrelated, what would you say to someone who would compare the development of iconography as an integral part of orthodoxy to the Catholic idea of the development of doctrine? It seems like it developed as a seed of incarnation theology. Well, what we would say is that iconography develops and doesn't develop. the theology of the icon, which is exactly what that is theology in the image, that can't change. There's uncanonical icons, but there's a freedom. There's some sort of freedom. It's not a free-for-all or something like that. There's things that can develop. Well, within the church, too, like the iconostasis was a development. But the theology of the iconostasis and the liturgy stands behind that has not actually developed. So we just got to be a bit nuanced about and say in a way yes and in a way no, and then distinguish it that how that's actually different from where's the I'll find the book, hold on. Or maybe it isn't here, maybe it's in one of the boxes. Cardinal Henry Newman's I guess it is in the box. Development of Doctrine. I thought it was right here. It's crazy. Don't worry, I'm getting bookshelf. This is just a temporary bookshelf. I'm gonna get my IKEA, and then all my boxes of books will be put in their right place, and then I can pull that book out and show you. Which is so strange. I thought I had. It's not. Sorry. Anyways, you get the idea. All right, back to school. Is there a slight echo? It might be the room, actually. Just I think this is all good. The mic. Okay, let's talk about more regret. Got a slide on more regret. No, I didn't put a slide up for more regret, but basically another way in which Ross's theory handles moral conflicts is moral regret. And regret is just our way of acknowledging some forsaken duty. So something's been sacrificed. When prima facie duties conflict with one another, one takes priority over the other. That means the lesser doesn't disappear. It's not like you say promise keeping and fidelity is not important. And that's why you have regret. Why? What is regret? Something of value was lost. So that allows you, pluralism allows you to say, they're all intrinsically valuable. But sometimes, when they conflict, when prima facie duties conflict, I've got to prioritize. I don't know what to tell you guys. I feel bad about it. Why do you feel bad? Because something has value that had to be lost in the decision or take a subservient kind of position. And that's great. Ross's pluralism can account for that. And that shows there's something, for example, really important about fidelity or gratitude. Even if it's not all important or absolute. And that's exactly what Ross believed. Now, let's turn to so that's what I just summarized there. Explains why regret is sometimes appropriate even when one has done nothing wrong. Also advantages of Ross's view. It addresses absolutist arguments. We just saw he's able to get around the problems that the absolutist has that we saw in the argument from contradiction, the argument from disaster prevention, and the argument from irrationality that we reviewed in chapter 15. So let's move to, therefore, addressing the anti-absolutist arguments, he does provide a direct, i.e. Ross, reply to three of the going back here. Okay. Three of the arguments of the absolutists. The argument of contradiction, the argument from disaster prevention, the argument from irrationality, as I just stated. But Ross's view can also make quick work. For example, well, let's go over the contradiction. We saw that. And why is he able to resolve that conflict? Because the rules that he favors are not absolute. Okay, let's just review argument from disaster. The argument claims that any moral rule that may be broken, if that's what it takes to prevent a catastrophe. As a result, no moral rules are absolute. Well, what do we find with Ross? Yeah, he agrees with that. None of his mules are his mules. Guess what, guys? None of his mules are absolute. None of his moral rules. You see what I did there? I just smashed moral and rule into a mule. A mural. A moral mule. No, moral rules. None of his moral rules are absolute. So, yeah. Okay, when the stakes are high, each one of them may be sacrificed. Reasonably so. And that leads us to the notion of reason and the argument from irrationality. And that was to charge absolutism as, hey, you're inconsistent, absolutists, since the values at the heart of absolutist rules, well, they can sometimes be better served by violating those rules. I.e., it would be rational if you violated those rules, but you're just a blind rule follower to the point of being irrational. And yeah, Ross is going to agree with that. His theory is going to accommodate for that. He's going to say, if we must break a promise in order to ensure that many more are kept, Ross can allow that promise. Should be broken. So the charge of irrationality stems from the absolutist claim that certain rules must be obeyed no matter what the consequences. And what do we see with Ross? He rejects that claim. So he has a response to the argument of irrationality. But he also denies a push for consequentialism, utilitarianism, that lies at the heart of both those arguments, because that's what you might have thought, like, well, that just sounds like a utilitarian consequentialist argument. Both of them try to show the morality of our actions depend on the results. And if I can leave you with this, as far as kind of summarizing consequentialism or utilitarianism, what is that theory? If you wanted to put it as short summation as possible, all that matters is the results. There's nothing that's intrinsically morally valuable. The only thing that makes something morally valuable or immoral are the results. So when we went back to, when we're looking at those arguments right there, those two arguments of the three, you might think, dang, man, that's pushing me into consequentialism. You think of those two arguments like this. If obeying a rule leads to a catastrophic outcome, right, here's the argument from disaster, i.e. or results, and greater violations of the rule, then that rule cannot be absolute. Therefore, those are consequentialist, right, because they're depending on results, reasons for rejecting absolutism. But Ross believed more rules are not absolute. And he didn't get there by assuming consequentialism. That's the big difference. And it's an essential point. He didn't get there and assume with the consequentialist that our moral duty is always to maximize good results. But he did agree, as I mentioned earlier, with both Kant and utilitarians, he did agree with utilitarians that results are morally important. What did he disagree? They're not absolute. It's not the be-all, end-all, right? So he's not a utilitarian. He denied that they're all important. Yeah, doing justice, for instance, or improving oneself is sometimes more important than being what the consequentialists call optimistic. And basically he says, he's got an argument against consequentialism, in fact. He says, imagine this. We can benefit person A or B. We can benefit person A by fulfilling our promise to him, or we can benefit person B just slightly more, though we've made no promise to him. If we benefit B, we break a promise. Further, B has no expectation that we will benefit them. So, Ross thought it's obvious we ought to keep our promise to A. Even though we would do more good, we'd be more optimistic, we'd have better results by benefiting B. So, he's appealing to your moral intuition. You probably agree with that too. Again, you can either benefit A or B, and you can benefit A by keeping or fulfilling your promise to person A, or you can benefit B a little bit more. But you've made no promises. There's no kind of duty there. If you benefit B, you break your promise to A. So again, he's going to one of his lists, numbers on the list of his prima facie duties, and saying those are important. Maximizing benefits is not an absolute most important. And that shows that because you intuitively think that, no, I'm going to go with my promise to A, even if breaking that promise would do and bring about better results or benefits for B. And if that's true, consequentialism is false. Now let's talk about some problems. And by the way, that's just supposed to illustrate that there's a prima facie duty of fidelity. There's always something morally important about, obviously, keeping our word. And second, consequentialism, as I showed, was mistaken, since that case in which one benefiting B produces the most good, but it's morally wrong, violating one of our principles, not absolute principles, but prima facie principles. Now let's talk about non-malfeasance as being a problem for Ross. So we set Ross up, his view of ethical pluralism, and as we always do, then we attempt to provide critiques for that. Let's see if anybody else has made any super chats or tips. I'll put it in the chat in case you don't. Okay, let's pull up the PowerPoint slide for the next. I'm getting ahead of myself. Before I get there, I want to talk about non-malfeasance. What does that mean? Preventing harm to others. That's always important. Sometimes it's the most important thing that you can actually do, but not always. You're not an absolutist. Seeing that the guilty get their just deserts is also always very important. And if you remember us going over Kant, or if you know much about Kant, that just deserts, the guilty get their just deserts, is always takes priority over preventing harm. And this came up with stuff about, like, somebody was asking about, like, the death penalty and stuff like that. And typically people will make arguments about the death penalty in terms of really almost kind of like a utilitarian consequentialist. Well, we're going to judge the moral merit of that as if it's not intrinsically moral until it's determined by the results. So I would say it's good or bad, somebody says, and most people say this. Well, does it curb overall murder rates? Somebody might be like, well, you should do it, right? Is an incentive to, not to murder. It keeps society safe, or think about, it gives them, I remember somebody brought this up in class. Well, actually, it's a beneficial thing because it gives them time to repent. That, almost kind of in a Heideggerian, being towards death. You're being, now, your being there, your Dasein is Heidegger says, is going to be very different once you know that your being's not going to be. And so we be towards death. We be toward death, man. If you knew you were going to die tomorrow, I'm sure that you would exist and be in a very different way than you would if you weren't thinking about that. And so somebody said, well, maybe that's a gracious thing, that so you're satisfying the victim's desire for justice or something like that, and increasing. But all those seem to be utilitarian arguments. So you're saying that there's nothing intrinsically moral about the death penalty or immoral. This is judged by the results. Then you're utilitarian. Kant would say, no, it's justice, right? Lex talionis, the law of retaliation to make things right, set the scales back, right? It doesn't matter if it produces more good in society or more harm. Why? Because Kant's not a consequentialist. He's like, justice. So you've got to answer those questions in terms of like what paradigm, and then critique the paradigm. Like, is that a good reason to actually hold something like that? So again, Kant's an absolutist, and justice is always going to take priority to preventing harms. But if utilitarianism is right, it never takes priority. But if Ross is right, sometimes it does. Sometimes it actually does. And this leads probably all of us to naturally wonder, which is about a problem that's probably the hardest problem for Ross himself. Ross denies that there's any absolute moral rules. What does that mean? Well, it means that each moral rule can be broken sometimes. Here's the hard question, not only for me and you, but really for Ross. But when? When can you do that? Now, you might say, well, here, let me give you a list of when you can actually break, when it's permissible to break those rules, by ranking the rules, by placing them in order of like least important to most important. So maybe you'll do that. So in your mind, you're like, well, I just prioritize the importance of it so that whenever the lower ranked rules conflict with the higher ones rule out and win out. And that's how I determine my moral duty. Okay, maybe that'll work for you, but it ain't going to work for Ross, because Ross rejects that. He thinks there's no fixed ranking among. They're all equally important. So you can't appeal to a ranking among prima facie rules. There are none. There's no permanent ordering among those of importance. And it's not just Ross that has that problem. Think about, through a ranking system is possible in principle maybe. In practice, has anybody ever successfully pulled that off? So Ross doesn't allow it, maybe you're somebody that does allow it. Have you pulled it off? Have you come up with it? I'd like to see your ranking lists. Yeah. Okay, because that's, again, is going to harken back to more kind of fundamental principles of it's permanently listed in a hierarchy. But pluralism really kind of rejects that. Sometimes it's morally important to be grateful and to prevent harm. Sometimes it's not. Sometimes it's more important to be honest with people than to spare them the hurt feelings and honesty that the honesty may cause. Sometimes it's not. And we always kind of go over this in Discord or on here. It depends, right? Okay, you might agree with that, but how? When? Who has the answer to that? It's not really clear how we would even be able to decide what to do when certain things conflict. And that's because none of those prima facie duties has anything kind of built into it of moral weight. So there's no guidance that we have that we can use from case to case to help us with prima facie duties. If a duty is sometimes, but not always, more important than another, then how do we know which one to obey? Sometimes this, sometimes that. What do I do? It's a very, very difficult question. And before we try to even attempt to answer that, you might have to answer an even more difficult question. How can we know which prima facie duties are real and which ones are mere pretenders? Next week, no, I'm kidding. We'll keep doing it tonight. Now, is there really a prima facie moral duty of self-improvement, for example? Of course, Ross thought so, but many people don't. Many people think that letting, for example, oneself go, I don't know if that applies to me, my beard. Am I letting myself go, guys? He just let himself go. He wouldn't trim his beard. I cut his hair. He looked like a hippie. I'm not a hippie, I'm Orthodox clergy. I worked really hard. I didn't let myself go. I worked really hard to... Okay, back to our consideration. Some people don't think letting yourself go is a moral failing at all. We probably do. There's something morally inadequate about that. But that's beside the point. How would we settle that matter? How would we settle that dispute? And it seems we must first know the true list. Ladies and gentlemen, we're on an expedition to find the true list of prima facie duties, where no man has gone before. Well, yeah, you're going to have to get those before you can get more specific questions on how to strike an appropriate balance between prima facie duties when they conflict. And that leads us to, again, the difficult problem of knowing the fundamental moral rules. So just summarize 2 questions. How do we know what our prima facie duties are? How do we know what to do when our prima facie duties conflict? Obviously, the standard way of justifying a rule is not open to us here. We cannot cite more general rules to back up the ones in question. Why? Because if the rule is really fundamental, then there's no deeper rules from which it derives its force. When we can call such a rule into question, how can its correctness be defended? Now we go into, Ross had an answer like all philosophers do when they're desperate. Oh, it's self-evident, guys. Well, didn't you know? As I say, the recourse of every epistemic despot, well, it's self-evident. Whenever you get trapped, you just put self-evident. Now, self-evidence, as Russ Shafer-Landau insists, is a claim is self-evident if and only if a claim is self-evident just in case it is true and adequately understanding is enough to make you justified in believing it. Now, I would say that that's a bit misleading as far as, there's a couple different problems with this. So if we look at this definition right here, a claim is self-evident just in case it is true. Okay, well it's kind of begging the question. And because then you're saying, well, how do you know that it's true? Well, if you just understand what I'm saying, then it's true. Or you just grant me, well, how do we know that you're understanding? Like, it just pushes it back farther. So what self-evident claims are supposed to do is, the work that they're pretending to do that I have a problem with is, see there it says enough. It's sufficient. That means there's nothing more that the claim depends on for its justification. If you just understand what I'm saying, so it's presenting, if you just understand what the statement is saying, for example, all bachelors are married, well, it's true, and it should be justified if you just understand what those terms mean. It's enough. But the problem is that it presents it as an isolate. When you say enough, but it's not enough. Because Quine goes through this, especially with the all bachelors married or any kind of analytic a priori, and then some of the other ones are maybe synthetic a prioris or something like that in kind of Kantian terms, is it depends on other things, you understanding other things. So it's not self-evident. It depends. It's not enough to understand. It requires its justification from other things. So one thing you didn't put in here is that self-evident, what it made clear in the definition is self-evident claims are properly basic. They're fundamental. They don't derive their justification from other concepts or arguments, meanings, but nothing's like that. This is what Seller talks in the myth of the given, and I have plenty of critiques of this, kind of stuff too. Furthermore, my second critique of self-evidence would be, why is that a justification? You're going to have to actually explain, even if that's true, claim is self-evident just in case it's true. Why would that be a justification? Why is that a good reason to... Well, you can't appeal to anything else because it's the self-evident, right? It's supposed to be enough. So it ends up that the very notion of self-evidence seems to be viciously circular. And it doesn't even get into the realm of talking about what constitutes is justification. And I don't want to get too far off the problem, but it's important and relevant. For example, Robert Chisholm in his Prima criterion. Number one, what are we justified in believing, or what is the extent of our justified belief? That seems to be an important question in epistemology. And number two, what makes our beliefs justified, or what are the criteria of justification? And what was awesome about what Roderick Chisholm points out is you can't answer the first one, what are we justified in believing, unless you already have an answer to the second question, what makes our beliefs justified? And you won't be able to answer the second question, what makes our beliefs justified, unless you already have an answer to the first, what are we justified in believing? So to identify our justified beliefs, you need a criteria of justification. And to specify the criteria of justification, you need to be able to identify particular instances of justified belief. And so you're caught in a vicious circle. You can't answer one until you've answered two, and you can't answer two unless you've answered one, and therefore you can't answer either. And there's something very similar that you see here with the very self-evidence, like to when we're asking about the question of justification, we're going to be led back to that problem of criterion. Simply saying, oh, I just gave you a definition of self-evidence as if that's going to solve the problem. So, sorry, Ross, you lose. Because, Ross, you believe your stopping points will be self-evident claims require no further justification. But what did I just show? That claim that's actually justification is going to require further justification. All right, let's see. Anybody doing tips tonight? I will be taking tips and answering questions. Yes, we got some tips here. Let's give a big shout out to Space Plumber. Donate $10. My meals are too stubborn to allow for contradiction. That's right. For some of you joined earlier, we had moral mules. And how do you get a moral mule when you contract and smush morals and rules together, you get mules. If there was anything we learned tonight, that was it. Thank you, Space Plumber. Okay. You guys enjoying this so far? How do we know the fundamental rules? Okay. When our fundamental duties conflict, Ross insists there's not a mechanical procedure to decide which action is right. I don't know if you're going to be satisfied with this. We must rely on our best judgment. Why? Because we can't be certain what's right. Well, that's sure to satisfy everybody in ethics and philosophy, Ross. But maybe he's right. Maybe there's nowhere else to go. That's the best you can hope for. So, let me go to, let's see. There was some stuff before this section here on knowing the right thing to do. Let's talk a little bit about the self-evidence stuff some more, because he's trying to use that for testing moral theories. He says, look, he seems to have confidence in certain things, self-evidence, a deep harmony, and with common sense, guys. Says everybody. I'm not buying it, Ross. And he thinks that's the greatest benefit of my theory. We shouldn't overturn biddings of common sense just because it conflicts with a pet theory. Now, that might be true. There is something to be said about intuition. Is Ross cashing out exactly in the best way? Probably not. I wouldn't in terms of self-evidence, but again, I think there is something to be said for intuition. Many of us feel that Mona Lisa is a beautiful piece of work, of art. And that means you shouldn't abandon your belief in its beauty just because some new theory of art declares it only impressionist paintings or medieval, altarpieces to be really beautiful. Ross thinks you should give up the theory before tossing aside our deepest and more secure beliefs. Now, how that's going to work too? Because then what if you just become like, I'm never budging from my intuition? So there's got to be some sort of kind of compromise or dance between that. We might switch if the theory is convincing or not, but doesn't really kind of talk about that in here. But he goes on to say that, look, he talks about consequentialism as a theory, for example, and he's like, it's really tempting, guys. Consequentialism is really tempting, but it's fatally flawed because it failed to appreciate the fundamental moral concerns. Consequentialism, yes, does impose order, system, and a unifying principle under our moral thinking. But then Ross says you got to resist its charms. Why? Because they conflict, he thinks, with our deepest beliefs about what is truly morally important. I generally think he's probably right about that, especially with that example of person A and B. And a lot of things to consider through the consequentialist arguments, that no matter how popular, and it's in business ethics, it's in bioethics, medicine, there might be certain charms to it. If you go deep down inside with yourself and you start to realize, though, it just if you really think about it, it violates some of those kind of deeply held beliefs and intuitions, moral intuitions that you hold as important. And there is something to be said about common sense. Okay, again, I'm just saying that I don't think Ross is cashing that out in the right way. So yes, you can defend moral intuition and common sense and stuff, but maybe not the way Ross has. Let's see. Now, he does, going on, say that that's probably going to be little comfort for those who don't agree with the 7 principles. But that doesn't get Ross to back down. For example, to someone who thought about justice, for instance, and failed to see its moral importance, you ask Ross, what are you going to do? And Ross is going to say that, look, I can only do one thing. And I think this is an important kind of conversation, just kind of related to whether debates, philosophy, or apologetics, or something like this. So, what happens when somebody disagrees with you? Well, there's only one thing you can do. Like Ross says, you can invite the person to think more carefully about, for example, what justice is. Or maybe you'll draw analogies. We philosophers like to do that. For example, let's consider the analogy so that I can draw analogies, cases that reveal the importance, in this case, of justice, if somebody's not convinced about justice being fundamentally an important value on, for example, the way Ross does. Distinguish justice from other possibly related notions, or ensure the particular beliefs opposing the importance of justice are unreasonable, or something like that. But suppose now that you do all that and the person says, nope, I'm not convinced. What do? Now, I know what Aristotle would do. Aristotle says when reason fails, you appeal to ad baculum, the stick. You give him a philosophical beatdown with the stick. This is not what Ross says, and it's what I don't encourage you to do either. But what are you going to do after you're exhausted and the person remains unconvinced, even after all that further reflection and things that you're going through with them? Well, guess what? The conversation comes to an end. And that's what Ross says too. That's the sort of kind of line out of the Bible. Don't throw your pearls at swine. Like, walk away. Don't throw your pearls at swine. The discussion has now come to an end. And the only verdict to render is that this person's mistake. What else are you going to do? This happens all the time, especially in our Discord. You get people in. You spend hours working through these arguments, and they're still not convinced. Well, as I always say, at that point, not being convinced, that's a you problem. I've done everything I can to help you. You're wrong. Okay? And if somebody says, no, well, then you're back to the same, oh, well, then are you actually open to entertaining the possibility that we think through this issue, for example, of justice, what that means in a deeper way? You want to go back to the analogies? No, we're all done with it. Well, then what are you going to do? You've just got to walk away. He also says that Russ Shafer-Landau says, this might strike you as close-minded. But two things can be said in Ross's defense. Just what I said. What's the alternative? And I imagine close-minded, it is good to be close-minded about some things. I think what he's saying is like unreasonably close-minded or something like that. So first, what are the alternatives? Why must it always be possible to offer something more in support of one's beliefs? If the process of offering justification for one's belief, whether ethical or not ethical, like we were talking about epistemology or whatever, ever does stop somewhere, then once we've reached the stopping point, we've reached the stopping point. All that could possibly be done is to invite the doubters to reconsider. I hope that you reconsider what I'm saying. I hope you think about. But beyond that, there's not much we could do. Second, we should consider the possibility of non-moral context, of finding ourselves without any support for a claim that we rightly continue to believe. For instance, and this one's hilarious, there may be nothing you can say that will convince a member of the Flat Earth Society of his mistake. No way to convince someone who believes in vampires that she's wrong. No clear path for showing a stubborn person that creating a square circle is impossible. You may be justified in your beliefs, even if you can't always convince those who disagree with you. That's why I said, if I present an awesome radical argument and somebody says, I'm not convinced, oftentimes I'll just say, well, that sounds like a problem you need to take up with your psychologist. That sounds like a you problem, right? My argument was awesome and rad. Like, it was infallible. You cannot. So what's funny is they don't critique the argument oftentimes and say, yeah, there's something wrong with that second premise there. It might be valid, but it's not sound, and I'm not buying it. But you telling me you're not convinced is just a reporting a psychological state. And I'm like, there's medication for that. We could sign you up, get you a prescription. That would be actually awesome. You ever find yourself unconvinced? Well, try Convincicon, right? And this is my these are actually security envelopes. Suppose this was my prescription of Convincicon. Now, I would never use Convincicon on myself, but I'd just be like, well, just put that in somebody's little drink there, and voila, they're convinced of your argument. Again, that's a psychological issue. That's not a issue of the argument unless they're actually critiquing it. Yeah, and the flat earth thing was kind of funny because I saw some it was a documentary, and these guys constructed this experiment, and they were like, if this experiment, like, they're trying to do good science and almost kind of a Karl Popper kind of way of let's make it easily falsifiable. And they were like, if this doesn't work, then we'll abandon our theory. This is like on Netflix or like Amazon Prime, you can see it. And I can't remember exactly the details of the experiment. Some people lied. It doesn't work. And in the beginning of the movie, they promised they would abandon their theory of flat Earth. And what do you think happened at that? And like when their experiment didn't work, they were like, "Oh," they didn't abandon. They're like, "We got to go back to the drawing board and something." And it's just like, it's kind of like what Shafer is saying here in this ethics book, that there's nothing you can do that's going to convince these, unless you actually give them medication or something like that. There might be a lot of people, I know we're picking on flat earthers, but you put in your favorite, plug in your favorite person, the ideology that you want to, that you think, that just kind of live kind of this non-falsification. There's nothing you can do. So I may be justified in believing what I believe, even if I can't convince you. And that will hold, obviously we're talking about non-moral things, but that holds within the domain of ethics as well. Okay, now we can go back to the PowerPoint. We talked about one of the problems was knowing the right thing to do, but there's no definite method for guiding us from an understanding of the prima facie duties to a correct moral verdict in a given case. And you have to start your moral thinking about specific situations by understanding the kinds of things that can be more important. And this matters, it's grasped clearly by the prima facie duties, and these duties tell you what to look out for. Has a promise been made, for example? Has a wrong been done? Is there opportunity for self-improvement, etc.? But once you answer these questions, you're basically, from what Ross has given us, you're on your own. You kind of have to bring your own experience and insight, bear on the details of every given case, right? And the bad news is, it doesn't seem like there's any fixed or mechanical procedure to tell you how to do that. So that was going back to how do we know? When our fundamental duties conflict, Ross insists there is not a mechanical procedure to decide with it. We must rely on our best judgment, your experience, and you can't be certain what's right. And maybe that's the best we can hope for. Okay, so, Ross's theory is not the only ethical theory that abandons the idea of a moral decision procedure. So maybe we shouldn't be so hard on Ross. Virtue ethics, consequentialism could all be said to fail to supply a procedure for determining our moral duty. But what do we mean by that? Or how can we see that? Well, if more than one thing is intrinsically valuable, which all those theories, let's say, I guess consequentialism wouldn't view that, but the others view more than one thing is intrinsically valuable, then it will be unclear what to do when we maximize one value without maximizing the other. Actually, I do think that you could be a consequentialist and hold some things to be at least qualified. They're not instrumental goods, but they might be desirable in their own right. I don't know, I'll have to think about that some more. That's interesting. If the results is all that matters, then can anything be an end in its own right? That's an excellent question. Well, in the absence of decision procedure, even for we saw that with consequentialism too. That it doesn't give you a procedure of how to actually get optimistic results. And in the absence of a decision procedure mechanism, it arriving at conclusions. Well, it's not just consequentialism that has that, or the other ethical theories. You see this in science too. Think about this. When scientists faced with a conflict between the data and some favored theory, have no uniform method for determining whether to modify their theory or rethink their data. So, when the data are uncontroversial, for example, so let me just re-summarize that. Scientists faced with a conflict between their data and some favored theory have no uniform method for determining whether to modify the theory or rethink their data. How are you going to do that? Is the science going to tell you that? Even when the data is considered uncontroversial, selecting the best theory to account for them is not a mechanical procedure in science, despite what scientists and people may think. They have to rely on good sense. Choosing which theory to believe is a matter, really, of kind of balancing the virtues of competing theories. And in the philosophy of science, there's things that, not getting into like what scientific paradigm would be true, because you could have competing ones that are all equally, well, I don't want to get into that. Let's just say you have competing scientific paradigms or theories. Why would you prefer one over another? Well, we in philosophy of science have several kind of principles. One is parsimony, and that's don't violate Occam's razor. Don't employ more assumptions, and so you'll favor the one that has fewer assumptions, less kind of causal, right? If you have one cause that can answer it versus multiple causes, that's parsimony. You prefer that. Conservatism. So that's another principle in philosophy of science. Preserving as much as possible is what I already believe, right? You want to like throw everything out from the history of thought. Generality. You want a theory explaining the broadest ranges of things. Testability is another kind of rule. You have a theory being open to experimental challenge and confirmation, unlike the example we just saw with the flat earth dudes. Can't be tested, right? Unfalsifiable. And there's more, we could go on. But the problem is, suppose that one's has more parsimony, is more conservative too. We've got those two. But another theory is more general and more testable. What do you do? Or suppose that one theory is far more conservative than any competitor, but it's also somewhat less general and a fair bit less parsimonious. Is science going to tell you which one to choose? It doesn't offer a definite procedure for identifying any better theory. Sometimes it might just be intuitive. It's just obvious this is a better theory. And this one's worse. Sometimes it kind of reminds me of, maybe you don't like that, but I'll give an analogy. Could you say that this person clearly loves person A more than this other person loves A? Wouldn't it be absurd to say, well, you can't say that unless you can quantify that? By how much? Like what number? Well, some things are kind of intuitive. It's like, well, I don't know. I don't have to give a number. Like, it's just kind of clear that the person, I can name various things, but I don't have to quantify it. Or, I don't know, this action or taking this substance far worse than this substance, drinking Coca-Cola or something like that, or Pepsi. And somebody's like, you can't say that unless you quantify and put the exact number. It's like, okay, no. You can intuitively, right? There's a sort of kind of quality that you can pick on more or less. I can make a qualitative difference, a statement about qualitative difference, and things being more or less qualitatively without quantifying. That is to confuse category and to say, I couldn't actually give any qualitative differences unless it was quantitative. Well, then it would be quality would just be the same as quantitative. So easily refuted. Any other questions before we kind of go on? But so I thought that was kind of interesting about that too. Let's see if anybody's got any more tips and questions in the Streamlabs. All right. So this is going to lead us into, and we're almost done, into something called ethical particularism. Ethical particularists believe in moral truth. However, they reject ethical monism, ethical absolutism, and the existence of prima facie duties. So they're trying to give an account for the problems that Ross or somebody that's committed prima facie duties. But they're still an ethical pluralist. They're just not. They're not an absolutist, and they're not a monist, and they don't hold to prima facie duties. So according to particulars, something's moral importance depends on its context. That's what it means, particularism. That's where they get it from. So recall that one of the important essential features for prima facie duties is that they represent moral reasons that are always important. They're not absolute, but they're always important. Every time you do wrong, for instance, there's an excellent reason to repair that damage, right? So if you remember the seven things on Ross's list, there could be more, but reparation was one of them. So there is, without exception, something to be said for keeping one's promises. And true, prima facie duties point to features that are always morally important. That's kind of what we went over, it's a summary. But particulars deny that. They say nothing meets that description. The way that they construct it is that something's moral importance depends entirely on its context. Now, the thing to think about is if they're actually correct on that, then that really means there's nothing good at all about righting a wrong or benefiting someone or preventing. The moral value of something only comes in and depends entirely on the details of the case. So, prima facie moral duties, that certain features, promise-keeping, self-improvement, preventing harm, are always important, is false for them. And absolute moral rules that state certain features are not only always important, but also morally decisive, that these features settle the matter of our moral duty. Particulars say that's wrong, false, wrong. There are no prima facie or absolute moral rules for particularism. Yeah, I know, it sounds pretty crazy and drastic. But particularism occupies one end of the spectrum of moral theories, with the monistic absolute theories like ethical egoism and utilitarianism at the other. And if particularism is right, then morality is entirely particular to specific situations. There are no moral rules at all to help us navigate our way through the world. If particularists, again, are right, there is sometimes no reason to keep our promises at all. But a prima facie rule says that X, now put whatever you want in there, moral self-improvement, doing justice is always morally important. So what particularists will try to do is come up with counterexamples where X has no moral value at all. And if they can do that, then supposedly they can show nothing possesses any fixed moral importance. I would think that would just show in that particular case, but maybe that proves their case. Okay, next. The particularist argument. Number one, premise one, if nothing possesses permanent moral importance, then there are no prima facie or absolute moral rules. Two, nothing possesses permanent moral importance. Three, therefore, there are no prima facie moral rules. And if there are no prima facie or absolute moral rules, then particularism is true, therefore particularism is false. Now, I know I've got 5 statements there, but the argument really only has 3 premises. Okay. 1, 2, and 4. Because 3 is a conclusion, 5 is a conclusion. And I forgot before we get to this real quick. Particularists are going to have a problem with that it gives us no moral guidance. For gaining moral knowledge. So Ross's theory, as we know, came into that same criticism. And we don't know how to balance out prima facie duties when they conflict. But particularism takes it even further. At least Ross was able to instruct us on what to look out for in various cases we might face. But particularism doesn't. It tells us anything that has once been a force for good may at other times be either morally neutral or positively bad. There's no way in advance to know how things are going to play out, nor is there any method to follow that can clue you in to the correct moral verdict of any given situation. So they've got the same problem, but even worse. There's no general roadmap to follow for those who want to know their moral duty and particularism. So that seems to be a problem. You must just insist that your moral knowledge comes only through a comprehensive appreciation of all the features, but how is that possible? So if particularism fails to supply a general blueprint in all its details for gaining moral wisdom, then that's a serious problem. Yet, this is a serious failing only if there is such a blueprint, is what the objector says. Touche, you got me. But there may be. Well, that's something that has to be worked out. So that was just, I wanted to bring up a criticism real quick of ethical pluralism, and then we're back to the particulars. Of the particularism, inability to account for moral knowledge or having its own method that's even worse than there is no kind of guide or blueprint whatsoever, roadmap for. Okay, now going back to the particulars argument, I'd say that premise 1 is not controversial. Nobody's going to attack that. Probably not 4 either. If there are no prima facie or absolute moral rules, then particularism is true. So to argue for is false, you'd actually have to say that this is a fallacy of false dichotomy. Well, what's the third option? But it seems like, I guess that's true. There's no prima facie or absolute more than particularism. True. So it's pretty secure. So if you have any doubts, or if you want to critique particularism, where are you going to go? Number 2, right? Excuse me, that kind of sounded crude. I'm going to go number 2. Okay. The premise 2, excuse me. Now, that's going to depend if there's absolute rules on a course or whether there's any features. For example, maximizing happiness. One way to refute that might be God, right? God commands, the divine command theory or something like that. To undermine particularism, they might say you got to provide examples of that. Okay, so on to the last. It's just summarizing, and we'll end here. So it's about almost two hours, right? Normally I do lectures for an hour and a half. I can take any super chats or tips, questions. But let's just summarize. Look, what did we see with particularism? A lack of unity, difficulty accounting for moral knowledge, and some things do seem to possess permanent moral importance. And if that's true, those are all good reasons why you might want to actually reject particularism. Is it really all about context? Is that the only thing that... Okay, so thank you. We have finished, if you're in my class, we've finished the book, The Fundamentals of Ethics. And this lecture here, what did we do? We did a review of chapter 15 about ethical pluralism in general, and what absolute moral rules are. And then we went into Ross's theory of prima facie duties in chapter 16 and ethical particularism. We built up his case, right? The cases for those, the arguments, and then we considered problems and possible objections, which then leaves you to think through it further. So without further ado, let's turn to see if anybody put any more money in the meter. Coins in the video game. What's the analogy I'm looking for here? Money in the tip in the Streamlabs. Any questions? Here's you got one last chance before, somebody got it. Thank you, Exposing Powerful Lies. Good to see you, Crispy Johnson. Who else do we got in here? How many people do we have? 20? I got to do more videos. I used to be up in my number. What happened to me? How I've fallen from grace. It might also be because, and forgive me, Patrick Cotel, I think you might be streaming too. I didn't know no better. I didn't know you were doing that when I apologize. And again, one of the great things about Patristic Faith, which is the new website that I've launched, is all our great content providers. We're going to have more of a calendar and be organized so that we don't overlap. You'll get announcements, who's live, stuff like that. Continue to pay attention to that because we're announcing, new people that are really big that you're going to be really excited about. We're also going to do a stream soon where we get all the major content providers on there. And we're just going to have a live stream together where we take in all of your submissions for the Patristic Faith logo. And we're just going to have a fun time going over. We'll let you guys vote. We'll make a kind of final decision on that and announce whose logo for Patristic Faith are we actually going to go for with? So that should be fun. If you haven't signed up for Patristic Faith, do, so we can get you on the mailing list. Consider supporting us there at the Patreon or PayPal. And really good. We're really excited about this. And any other questions? Let me just double check real quick to make sure nobody else put a tip in before, because I hate leaving to later find out where I shut the stream off, and then I find out that somebody had actually put a tip on. Any questions before? So that's a full lecture. I'm putting together a lot of these. I do like kind of a free half, and I'm going to package these so that they're more affordable for you too. And if you like this, you can find, my lectures on Gumroad. I'm going to put more up there. I'm also I think I'm going to put up some political philosophy where I went over this book together with Eric Vogelin. I recommend getting this book. It's a real short read. It's great. Science, Politics, and Gnosticism. But as far as just historical survey that's not polemical in any way, and it's just kind of a really good survey of kind of modern political thought from Machiavelli to Marx, and I actually do a course on that, and I'll package that up for sale too as a university course. Of course, the logic, an intro to philosophy, and the ethics, and hopefully more to come, and more consistency too, and better packages. I'm always happy with your feedback on what you guys want, ways that I can improve, etc., etc. Okay, let's see. I think I'm just going to check real quick to see if you guys have any other questions. Good to see all of you. Thank you again for your support. Don't forget to like this video, subscribe to the channel if you haven't, and tell your mommy and pappy and your friends too. And I wish you a blessed rest of the Sunday evening and a great week. And for all of you students out there, may God bless you as you go in studying for your finals, finishing your final papers. May He give you wisdom, discernment, diligence, perseverance, and stamina to do well, and make your mom and dads and your friends proud. And I wish you, all of you, the best. And hey, Dave. Hey, Jason. God bless you guys. Exposing Powerful Lies. Crispy Johnson. All of you, if I've left out any names, forgive me. And for my students, I'll be uploading this onto our Moodle. All right. Let me just check one more time to make sure that I'm not leaving anybody out for the super. I'll give you one last chance to give a tip. Okay, that's it. And with that, I bid you all a farewell. God bless, guys. Thank you again for your support. Bye-bye.